All right, greetings and salutations. This is Abe Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth. I want to talk a little bit today about perspective. Those of you who don't know, I'm recording this on June 6th. You may not hear it on June 6th, but that's okay. It's the 50th anniversary of Robert Kennedy actually dying. He was shot on June 5th and died the next day. And I bring that up because I think the interesting thing about Robert Kennedy is the trajectory that he had made. It was a largely Shakespearean trajectory, if you know the story about him and his family and John F. Kennedy and all that kind of stuff. And what happened was after the Kennedy assassination, he had gone through a remarkable transformation, whereas before he was kind of a pseudo-liberal hawk. He was more liberal than, say, Barry Goldwater, but he was still one of the architects of getting us advisors into Vietnam, not necessarily into Vietnam. That was more Johnson's responsibility. But he had no problem with fighting communism and making that appearance, especially for the sake of his brother, who he just adored and was always looking out for his best interest. So he wanted to make sure that image was a champion of American ideals and everything else. But all that to say that by the time he had died, he had more than proven some of the emotional changes he had made. He was going down to Mississippi and poor rural parts of Kentucky, and just meeting with poor kids, and I'm talking distended bellies and things like that. There's a great 4-part series on Netflix called Bobby Kennedy for President, and if you've not seen it, I recommend that you do. Even though you might be a Kennedy aficionado, you think you've seen everything. Trust me, you have not. It's a lot of footage you have not seen, and a deeper understanding and a very well-rounded understanding of who Robert Kennedy was and who he became, especially after his brother's death and what he was really trying to do. And it was just really sad that 2 months after Martin Luther King got killed, he got killed. But I talk about all this to just kind of get us into the topic that I want to get into, which is perspective. Again, he had changed dramatically, as such did his perspective, and I think we suffer from perspective in a lot of ways. And when I say that, I mean here in America, we suffer from the American media and what I like to call American exceptionalism. For example, what they call the war in Vietnam, they don't call it the Vietnam War. They call it the American War, because that was an area where we have invaded illegally, killing 60,000 of our kids and 1 million Vietnamese civilians. And so the challenges we get all the time is the American media perspective, which has become more and more corporate than it ever has been. And ever since Clinton deregulated the communications industry in 1996, allowing the consolidation and mergers of one company after the next, now we're down to 6 major corporations owning all of the media. And you have 2,400, former officers and generals in the military with defense contracts who also double dip and serve as military analysts for, say, MSNBC or CNN or Fox News. And so they get on and they're talking about what? We need more F-16s. We need more this and that to justify the contracts that they take from the war machine. And so it's a really skewed narrative that we get in this country. And so I wanted to get into that a little bit. And by the way, I've got a beer and I've got another one that I'm about to open. So pardon me while I take a sip. Just because I'm by myself doesn't mean I can't have beer. But I want to get into some of this because, Iran and North Korea are back in the news as of today. And there was a phrase that George W. Bush used right before we got into Iraq, when we were ramping up into Iraq. And I fear that's happening with Iran now. Iran, who has not attacked anybody in the Middle East. The last known conflict I believe they had in the Middle East was with Iraq in the late 70s and 80s. And despite being in Syria and having some skirmishes with Israel, they're largely not a player in terms of violence and death in the Middle East. It seems to be us and the Saudis and the Israelis. So I want to jump into a term that George W. Bush used that was written for him by a guy named David Frum. And you might remember this. It was called the Axis of Evil. And it was funny because they named North Korea, Iran, and Iraq in that. And they didn't name Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, which I thought was interesting, given that we just came out of 9/11 and we're making all kinds of excuses to go into the Middle East aggressively. and 15 of the 19 hijackers in 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. A lion's share of the money came from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, in addition to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And we justified going into Afghanistan and Iraq, which is interesting. So I want to jump into all of that because as far as perspective goes, what I want folks to come away with this afternoon, tonight, is to understand the fact that our perspective is skewed. And as a for instance, we're taught that Iran, for example, are the villains. They're evil. They're crazy. They might have nukes. Well, no one asks questions about the Saudis, who are by far the most totalitarian theocracy in the Middle East. They chop more heads off than ISIS, and that's not to be meant as funny. That's a fact. They're horrible with gay rights. They kill gay people in Saudi Arabia. They're terrible with women's rights. I think just this summer they're going to get the right to drive, but only in the daytime. So there's a bunch of theocratic shit that they do that we don't ever call them on the carpet for. And yet we're going to listen to Benjamin Netanyahu, who's, by the way, Israel has never participated in an IAEA investigation or checkup, or whatever you want to call it, what we're subjecting Iran to in the deal that we're about to get out of. Yet Israel, who's never, by the way, admitted to working on anything, but the estimates are that they have about 400 to 500 nuclear warheads. The only people behind them is Pakistan and India. So that should cause a little alarm, and also that they don't seem to be bothered with rules. They've never reported. They don't talk about their nuclear program, yet we're going to hold Iran's feet to the fire on our nuclear program. And those of you that are hearing me for the first time or hearing this sort of thing for the first time, just understand there's a couple of platforms that I'm going to jump off of before I jump into this. First of all, if it's the government that's telling you that, well, the government are a bunch of lying cocksuckers, and so is the media. So there's that one platform. The other platform is there's conspiracy theory and there's conspiracy fact. And conspiracy theory, well, it's a theory. We didn't walk on the moon. That's conspiracy theory. Conspiracy fact is the proof, the bodies left behind of all the crap that we have done. We are the largest purveyor of terror in the world, bar none. And I want to get into David Frum's catchy little axes of evil, and I want to start off with Iran because a lot of folks don't understand what's going on with Iran. And I won't get into Iraq just yet, but as a little quick side note, Iraq was our friend when they were fighting the Iranians, and then all of a sudden, within about 3 months, they became our enemy, and they became, where Saddam was the Hitler of the desert. More on that later. But for right now, with Iran, folks don't understand what we've been doing there, what the Europeans were doing there before we became the top dog, and why it's Iran today, why we have the relationship we have today. And just to jump into it really quickly, you are very familiar, I'm sure, with the CIA and everything else, but let's just go back further than that. There's two Shahs. We always hear about the second Shah, who I call Shah II, versus his father, Shah I. And Shah II was overthrown in 1979, and I'll get into that in a second in more detail. But that's where we come in with most folks' understanding of the Iranian background. They understand that a bunch of Muslim radicals took over, and they kicked out some people say democratically elected Shah. He wasn't democratically elected. He was a dictator who we installed. But some people will say that. Or they'll say that it was a peaceful country and everything was fine. He was killing people for 26 years indiscriminately. And that's why folks attacked the embassy and overthrew the Shah and chased him out of the country, kind of like how folks voted for Donald Trump. Happy people don't vote for a demagogue. So when you've got things that are failing, you have an upset and you go ahead and replace that form of government. So jumping into it really quickly, Shah I was a guy named Reza Shah Pahlavi, who I call Shah I. And Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was Shah II, the Shah that you're probably familiar with. Now here's the thing to understand. Shah I ran Iran. That was his book title, by the way, Iran. I'm kidding. From 1925 to 1941. And he was tossed out by the Russians and the Brits. And why was that? Because he had nationalized Iranian oil. And that wasn't good for BP, and that wasn't good for Russia, because Russia was paying too much money for oil, and they wanted to get it cheaper as well. And so in that overthrow, they installed Shah II, the Shah's son. That's what kind of a prick he was. He was instrumental in overthrowing his own father, who later died in exile in 1944. But Shah II took over in 1941, wildly unpopular for the 9 years he was initially serving in office. He had two unsuccessful attempts on his life, and before he was ousted in 1951. Now, there was a democratic election, and there was a gentleman named Mohammad Mossadegh who won. He was a secular Muslim who was the Shah's prime minister, but this time he won for real in an election. And what had happened is he was going to do the same thing as Shah won, which was to do what? Nationalize Iranian oil. Now, at this point, it wasn't just BP interested in the assets of Iran. Now, America, with the brand new CIA, which was only a few years old, the former OSS had turned into the CIA. And Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, was running that operation. And so through fake protests and the Dulles brothers, they had ousted Mohammad Mossadegh in a coup that was organized by Kermit Roosevelt and the CIA. And just like Shah won, he was sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement only for the crime of running for office, which is insane. So he died in house arrest in 1967. From 53 to 79, the next 26 years were just nothing but a brutal third world banana republic dictatorship. But it was okay because he was our guy. To give you a quick side note, in Chile, we did the same thing in 1971. We overthrew a guy named Allende, who was the democratically elected president of Chile. And we installed Augusto Pinochet, who was this general, who ended up being this ruthless prick for 17 years. Bloodshed. Estimated he killed 10,000 of his own people. But he was our guy. He was our guy who was friendly to American copper, where Allende was not. Allende wanted to nationalize Chilean copper and keep it for the people. Doesn't that sound familiar? And this is the problem why the United States doesn't like democracies, because democracies act on their own accord. And if democracies act on their own accord, they're going to want to nationalize their own assets instead of buying equipment they don't need from companies who are going to charge them a fuck ton of interest and then have to rent out their people for a nickel a day and no bathroom breaks. So when the Shah got overthrown in 1979 and the Ayatollah took over, not going to lie, it was a very brutal changeover. They did the same thing the Shah did, except for to different people. And this is where people always kind of miss the boat. You know, well, the Shah didn't kill that many people. The Shah killed a lot of people. Well, the Ayatollah killed people too. Yeah, about the same amount as the Shah. It's okay when it's your guy, right? That's kind of what makes me angry about all of this, bipartisanship and everything else. It's okay when it's your guy, not okay when it's the other guy. You kill people, that's a bad thing. So when you think about why does Iran hate us, about a month ago when it was made public that Cheeto Jesus, otherwise known as Donald J. Trump, was going to be getting out of the Iran deal. And all these right-wing knotheads are saying, see, they're yelling death to America. Well, why the fuck not? We've been trying to kill them since the Sykes-Picot Agreement was signed in the 1910s. And we've done nothing but break a deal. That's all we have done is break deals. And we made a deal with them, which, by the way, the weapons inspectors have verified that they're honoring the deal because they want to play ball in Europe. They want to play ball with the U.S. They don't want to just have Russian and Chinese business. They, like any country, they want to do as much as they can. It's like a tree. You grow your roots as deep as you can. You reach, the leaves grow as many as you can. The branches go as high as it can. So they were excited about actually getting into the world economy involving Europe and the United States. And without reason, we're now pulling out of the deal, which is the stupidest idea ever. I mean, even a stop clock tells the time right twice a day. And Barack Obama, if he did one or two things right, which every president seems to do, even though Barack Obama was the third and fourth term of George W. Bush, he did do that Iran deal. And if you notice, we make deals with people who have nukes. Why are we talking to North Korea and not bombing them into the next century? Well, because they've got nukes. That's sort of the rule of thumb. I'll get into Libya and all of that in a second in the next part here. But when you look at what we've done with folks, the deals we've made with folks, and we're worried about disarming them so that we can continually bomb the shit out of them, basically, and then change over their, quote, regime at will, it's wildly hypocritical. And you want to know why Iran hates us? The Mohammad Mossadegh story that I just told you is as widely known in the Middle East as the JFK story is here. It is Middle East folklore. My dad's an Arab. I was about 15 years old when the Shah got chased out of Iran and the Ayatollah Khomeini took over. And they took the American hostages. And like every kid, I was like, those fuckers. And my dad's an Arab. He was raised there. And he started telling me this story about Mohammad Mossadegh. And I'm like, get out of here. The old man's daft. This is before internet. This is before anything, And I was too lazy to go, I already had to do enough book reports at school using microfiche, so I didn't look it up. Finally, a few years later, I'm in college. And I'm reading a world history book, and we're, talking about the Middle East. And in that section was Iran. And damn it if my father wasn't correct. That this guy named Mohammad Mossadegh was a democratically elected prime minister who was overthrown with the help of the United States, Kermit Roosevelt, and the CIA for American oil interests. And also it helped the Brits too, because BP got back in there too. And so these are the kind of things that I'm going to get into tonight, because I want folks to understand when you're looking at your own perspective, when you just continually look at things, we all do this. We look at the prisms, we look at things through the prisms of what we are given. So if I'm told all the time by either Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity that democratic socialism can't happen and single payer is a pipe dream and the $1.3 trillion we spent on defense is justified because they've got another military analyst on the air to tell me why we need all these B-1s and these F-15s and everything else and another battleship that costs, $50 billion, whatever the deal is. It's emotionally and intellectually dishonest to assume that there's no stake in that. When you look at the commercials of the mainstream media, it's all big pharma and defense. Why is Raytheon or whoever, Bechtel, why are they advertising on MSNBC? I'm not going to buy engineering services from Bechtel. I'm not going to buy a weapon from Raytheon. If I need a gun, I'll probably go to a gun store or Walmart. I don't need to go to these guys. What benefit is it to them to advertise on a TV station? Well, the benefit is that these people report as they're told. That's the benefit. And so when you look at what we've been doing overseas, and you look at, for example, what we were doing in Iran, and people are like, why are they yelling death to America? Because we keep fucking with them. It's emotionally and intellectually dishonest to assume that if I'm going to slap you in the face, you're not going to slap me back. And that seems to be American foreign policy in a nutshell. We assume that we're going to do what we want to do, and they're not going to do anything back. Pardon me while I take a sip of my beer. Collect that thought for a moment. That's good. And those of you who don't drink anymore, to quote Dennis Leary, still tastes great. So Iraq. Let's move to Iraq. Crazy Iraq. Saddam Hussein had to go. Really? Did he? Why? He's a dictator. He was killing his own people. Was he now? Okay, well, a lot of dictators kill their own people. We just don't seem to go after them. If they're our guy, like General Pinochet or the Shah 1, or Shah 2 rather, if they're our guy, they don't go. But if they're not our guy and they're sitting on a fuck ton of oil and they might be getting off the dollar and not using the petrodollar, then they got to go. And I'm going to get into that in a second. For those of you who aren't familiar with the petrodollar and the gold standard, and this, by the way, if you want to Google this, because this is, again, conspiracy fact, and it wasn't even a conspiracy, Nixon got us off the gold standard in 1971. And that was it. And if you want to YouTube the speech, it's hilarious. It's about a 15-second State of the Union address where he took time on the three major networks at that time and said basically, hey, how you doing? We're getting off the gold standard. Good night. And that was it. So Saddam was going to get off the gold standard, and I'll jump into that in a second. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But in 1979, he was the vice president of Iran, or Iraq rather. And, they say he took it over in a coup, and it was really what they call a soft coup because he was kind of incrementally taking it over a few years with the Ba'ath socialists because he was really a secular Muslim. He wasn't this religious guy, and Iraq was a pretty secular country. They were not a religious Muslim country. It was run by Ba'ath socialists. So in any case, it'd been a few years, and he'd taken it over in a coup officially in 79, installing himself as president. And, let's make no confusion here. Saddam Hussein was a piece of shit, as most two-bit dictators are. Excuse me. But for a while, he was our piece of shit. And while he was our piece of shit, we ignored a lot of things. And, for example, he was fighting Iran for us for the first 8 years of his presidency. And between him and the Iranians, they, killed about 700,000 of their own people between the soldiers and everybody. And at that time, too, we were also doing some things behind his back, which I'll get to in a second. But a couple of years after the Iran war, he notices that Kuwait had been cross-drilling into his oil supply for a while. And they were hoping he wasn't really paying attention because he was involved with the Iran war. Well, Saddam Hussein had found this out, and he said, hey, you guys better knock that off. And Kuwait said, hey, we got some pretty strong friends in America. And he said, I don't know if you've noticed, but so do I. I just fought a war for them for 9 years, basically. And Iran being supported by the Russians and Iraq at that time being supported by us, it was basically another ersatz hot war with a Cold War enemy. So he calls into his office April Glaspie, who was the U.S. ambassador in Iraq. Her name was April Glaspie, Glaspie. And at the time when we had an ambassador. And so he'd asked her, hey, listen, having a problem with Kuwait, and I want to know what the U.S. opinion is on Arab-Arab conflict. And she famously said, the United States has no opinion on Arab-Arab conflict. We just don't want you to bomb Israel. Now, mind you, she didn't check with the State Department. She didn't check with the White House. She didn't check with the National Security Advisor. She didn't check with the Secretary of Defense. Nobody. She just unilaterally said that to Saddam Hussein. Well, he was crazy, but he wasn't stupid. He's figuring he's got permission, so he invades Kuwait. And Bush 1, George Herbert Walker Bush, went ahead and waited it out. A couple of good reasons. One, we didn't want to start a precedent of invading countries in the Middle East. I'm getting that in a second. But two, he actually was in a war, unlike his knothead kid, and had been shot at having flown 23, 24 missions and watched his friends die. So the last thing he wanted to do on his watch was send kids to die in a war that could probably be avoided. So he kept giving Hussein time limits. Finally, around February of 91, Desert Storm happens, and we basically start carpet bombing Iraq. We never invaded them. And that's the reason why the other Arab countries were behind us, because the idea of invading an Arab country, given the history of the Middle East, if you don't know it, very hegemonic and European-driven and then U.S.-driven, invading the Middle East anywhere would have been bad. And as we have seen, it's still bad. So after 2 months of continual carpet bombing and not a peep from the Iraqis, they finally cry uncle, and we supposedly win the war. We killed about 300,000 Iraqi civilians, with only losing around 90 of our guys, largely by accidents. I have a friend whose cousin died on a flying drill when they were back there. That was the kind of, a flipped truck, guy falls in the bathroom when he's drunk, hits his head. I mean, stuff like that. It was 90 guys that died. Compared to 300,000 dead civilians. So all of that to say, I'm sure Iraq wasn't very happy with us. The Iraqi people were not happy with the United States. Another side note here: we bomb the shit out of these countries, and we wonder why we have refugees and terrorists. If France was bombing B-1 or buzzing B-1 bombers on the southern border of America, based in Mexico, we would turn Mexico into an ice skating rink overnight. Period. End of list. Yet here, again, it's emotionally and intellectually dishonest to expect someone to not act like a human being. But we do that. So flash forward to 2000, and Hussein decides to get off the dollar, basically telling the U.S. to go fuck itself. And he's going to get off the petrodollar. and get on the euro. Now, if you don't understand the significance of this, let me take a quick side note. In 1973, Kissinger and Nixon made a deal with the OPEC nations, which is basically the oil-producing nations, the Arab countries, that they were only going to deal in the dollar. And in exchange, they would get protection from us, kind of a mafia deal. They get protection from us and also a lot of technology. If you're Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and you don't have a trash collection system except for a bunch of wild goats eating your garbage, it'd be good to modernize. You have all that money, you have all that oil. A bunch of your kids are going overseas to get educated, coming back to goats eating trash in the street, as a for instance, in one area. So the OPEC nations agree. Also, the countries buying oil from OPEC do it in American dollars. If they can't afford to do so, we would loan them money in American dollars. Because at this point, we were off the gold standard. We had to back the dollar with something, which in this case was going to be oil. Now, in 2000, Saddam Hussein gets off the dollar, and he decides to go on to the euro. Tells the U.S. to go fuck itself, pardon me. And he's going to get on the euro. Now, Dick Cheney, or Darth Cheney, as I like to say, was in a think tank project, or think tank rather, called the Project for a New American Century. Now, this is in the year 2000. Remember, him and George W. Bush, the son, are running for president and vice president, respectively, right? So Dick Cheney is part of a paper that comes out that year that Hussein decides to get off the dollar, saying that this could be disastrous for the rest of the OPEC nations, sending a signal that we're weak, that we're not enforcers, that we're not going to do anything. Hussein can get off the dollar, and it would take about a decade's worth of sanctions to get him back on the dollar. And he's already been going through sanctions anyway. So it's not like we're going to hurt him anymore. People are already dying. They're not getting medicine. They're not getting food. Excuse me. We've got a lot of the European countries basically boycotting him. And so he's like, fuck this. I'm going to deal with the Europeans, get on the euro, and tell the Americans to go fuck themselves. Well, my favorite quote in the paper that I'm telling you about from the Project for a New American Century is, unless a Pearl Harbor type of an incident happens, we're going to have a hard time getting Iraq back on the dollar. This was in 2000. What happened in 2001? They were in the White House 8 months, and 9/11 happened. Now, whether it was conspiracy or, in my personal opinion, they knew what was going on, but they just covered their ass after the fact. So I won't go as dark as say it was a conspiracy. Obviously, it was a conspiracy amongst the Arab guys that did it, blah, blah, blah. That's a whole other show. But I'm just going to focus on the Christmas gift that they got in the form of 9/11, because now, instead of invading Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, the architects and money of 9/11, we're going to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. Why? Well, now because we can, because Americans have a short memory. They had a short memory in 1991. They forgot that Iraq was fighting our wars for us, and Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, well, in other capacities, were over there shaking hands on behalf of Reagan and Bush and being buddies with Saddam Hussein because he was fighting our war for us. We have an amazing short memory. 3 months later, he's the Hitler. This is Bush 1. He's the Hitler of the desert. He's a Hitler. He's a Hitler of the desert. They're killing babies on the floor out of incubators at hospitals. Turned out that whole thing was a fraud, completely manufactured. The so-called witness was the daughter of an ambassador to the United States from Iraq, and she was making this whole thing up. And they wouldn't say her name because, they want to protect her identity. Although we see her face, and she's crying her eyes out, and turns out her identity is that she's the daughter of an ambassador. So all that to say, we have our Christmas gift. Christmas came early, and we invade Iraq. Not just bomb it to get them to leave Kuwait like we did the first time. We invade without an exit strategy. We knock over a sitting leader, and Iraq, while Uday Hussein was out of his mind, raping college girls, the whole 9 yards. I know Hussein was not great to his people, but it's better than what it became. Estimates are as high as 1 million dead Iraqis. We lost 8,000 of our kids for nothing, just so Raytheon and Bechtel and anyone else, Boeing, can make money. And politicians full-throated supported the war on behalf of their corporate donors because they're whores. That's what they are. They're whores. So what did we do? And by the way, we knew. Even though they kept saying the pitch over and over and over, it's going to cost $50 billion. We're going to be in there for 3 months. Apparently, they didn't see The Princess Bride. Remember? Never getting a land war in Asia. That was in The Princess Bride and in Risk. And if you've ever played Risk, you know why Napoleon and Hitler got their asses kicked? Because they decided to go to Russia in the winter and get in land wars in Asia. And that's what sort of did them in. That's what's going to do us in, by the way. I'll get to that in a second. But the government knew it was not going to be $50 billion and 3 months. They knew it was going to be trillions of dollars, and it was going to be an endless war. However, the crumbs that they took from their corporate donors was more important than our kids' lives. We send poor boys to fight the wars of rich men. We haven't fought a war for our freedom since World War II. And we've only had a few wars for our freedom, unquote, in the history of this country. A few. Revolutionary War, War of 1812, World War II. Everything else, Spanish-American War, Civil War, World War I. Complete bullshit. I mean, there's a million reasons why we didn't have to go there. And we did it anyway, because it was the easiest thing to do. And Woodrow Wilson, the so-called Democrat who went ahead and started the League of Nations, jailed Democratic socialists like Eugene Debs for the sole crime of speaking their mind and speaking against the war. Woodrow Wilson invented the Espionage Act. There you go. So anyway, we knew it was going to be $50 billion. We knew it was going to be not going to be 3 months. We knew it was going to be trillions of dollars. We knew it was going to be endless war, which is what the war machine has been pushing for since World War II. They wanted endless war for obvious reasons. You sell weapons, you sell everything. So that was the point, though. On day one of mission accomplished, George Bush gets off the fighter that he didn't fly in that dopey flight suit, playing Army at the taxpayer's expense, the expense of our kids' lives, with that fucking banner that said mission accomplished. The only mission that was accomplished was Iraq was back on the dollar. And that's the truth. Because since we've knocked out that country, it's been nothing but a failed state. They just had another election, about a month ago, for the first time in years. We think we're just going to import democracy, and it's going to be just one big kumbaya clusterfuck of joy, and it's not. We destroy countries when we do this shit, which is why when you get to North Korea, let's jump into North Korea for a hot second. So North Korea. Interesting thing about North Korea is here we are, 2018. North Korea has been North Korea for about 65 years. And the reason they became North Korea was because there was a Korea. And not long after World War II, Truman, not being the brightest and the best, you think, think Trump with a better disposition. That's about it. He had his ear whispered into, if an original thought crossed his mind, it would be the shortest trip in North America. What was famously said about Truman when he ran for the Senate, a bunch of backroom guys, kind of like the DNC today, just wanted to prove that they could run a monkey and get him to win. Truman was a city councilman in Missouri who had basically been a failed businessman. His last endeavor was a failed haberdashery, men's clothing store, which is why he always wore those cool suits. So I'll give him credit for that. But all that to say, he became president when Roosevelt died. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, completely unnecessary. He's technically a war criminal. We were kicking their ass. They were going to surrender. We did it anyway. Oh, and by the way, for the record, the U.S. is the only country that's ever dropped nukes on anybody, just FYI. So we get into North Korea because we want to make sure that the communist threat is going to be curbed. We can't have the communists spreading. Better dead than red and all that shit. I can tell you stories about that crap. I lived through it. So we have the Korean War, and General Eisenhower, who becomes President Eisenhower, is not in office 6 months, and he's like, fuck this shit, we're getting out. We'll call it a draw. Let the commies have the North, let us have the South, and we got two countries now. And so you got Kim Il-sung, who was the grandfather, who was the original guy, and then his son, Kim Jong-il, who's the father. Some of you remember him last 20-odd years or so after Sung died. people were wondering why they're so crazy, why they're so obstinate. Well, remember, the last time the U.S. was in Korea, we killed 1 million civilians. We lost 60,000 of our own people. Doesn't that sound like Vietnam? Because it does sound like Vietnam. We killed 60,000 of our guys, and 1 million of theirs. And so we wonder why Kim Jong-un is crazy. Why is he making more nukes? Why is he taking over from his father's program? Because he has not seen the U.S. keep a deal that they've ever made. Whether it's the American Indian or the Arabs after the Ottoman Empire fell and the Sykes-Picot Agreement was done, that wasn't an American thing. That was a European thing. But we basically took over with flying colors. We basically did the same thing the Brits did and most of Europe did, was any deals you made with brown people were breakable. And we've been doing that for hundreds of years. And Kim Jong-un is an educated guy. I don't know what he does with his free time. Maybe, if you're a dictator, you got castles and hookers and cocaine, whatever you do. But the point is he's lived with those ghosts. Again, perspective. Mohammad Mossadegh was the JFK of the Middle East. People know that story intimately. More details than what I've told you. Kim Jong-un knows that story. He's seen the pictures of the devastation. He saw his country flattened and knows it could be done again. And why does he know it could be done again? Because we've got troops in bases in South Korea. We fly B-1 bomber drills every day, buzzing their border every day. We got troops in Guam. Why do you think they keep testing nukes over Guam? That's an interesting question that no one seems to like to ask. He's launching weapons over Guam and Japan. Yeah, we got troops in Guam and Japan, and we fly shit out of there. That's why. He's trying to make a point. So since we've been buzzing their borders with drills and B-1s flying in, for years now, and we've got soldiers in South Korea, along with the South Korean army, facing the DMZ daily, we wonder why he's a little paranoid. He knows that we know there's $3 trillion worth of unmined minerals in North Korea. He knows that we know he can't afford to mine those minerals, maybe, and participate in not the world market, but at least the BRIC, which is Brazil, Russia, Iran, and China, because he's too busy paying for nukes, and he's paying for nukes out of fear. Now, why would we go into North Korea? That's probably the reason. Why did we go into Afghanistan and Iraq versus Saudi Arabia and Pakistan? Well, Afghanistan has a ton of minerals that haven't been mined yet, especially about $1 trillion worth of lithium still in the ground. And they are the number one opium producer in the world, believe it or not. They are number one at something, and that's making heroin. Why do we have an opioid crisis in this country? Big Pharma gets cheap heroin from Afghanistan, and they make fentanyl, and they make OxyContin, and they make everything else. And then you wonder why we got these regular opioid overdoses from over-the-counter drugs. Prescription drugs. Isn't that interesting? So that being said, you look at Iraq, obviously oil. I think they're the top 3 as far as reserves in the world. And also the Tigris and the Euphrates River water supply of the Middle East runs through Iraq. They could easily have dammed that up if they wanted to and blackmail the rest of the Middle East for water, kind of like what Nestle does. But anyway, all that to say, why would Kim Jong-un be so leery? Why is he rattling his sword? Now they're supposed to meet next week in June. By the time you hear this, we'll already know what the result is. But why is he so leery? Well, they got John Bolton pissing in the president's ear now. If you remember John Bolton, famous UN ambassador who has never met a war he didn't like, is completely cool with bombing Iran right now, completely cool with the idea of bombing North Korea if these talks don't go well. And Kim Jong-un is leery to give up his nukes. And honestly, I hope he does not. Because when Libya gave up their nukes in 2003, when Muammar Gaddafi, another piece of shit, but hey, at least Libya was industrialized and people were getting educations and jobs and making money and eating food, as opposed to now where there's 40 terror groups running all of Libyan oil, not us, and there's slavery again. They brought back slavery. Everything comes back. Every fashion comes back. Short skirts come back. Tiny bikinis come back. Short hair comes back. Slavery's come back to Libya. They're selling Yemeni slaves now in Libya. And we went ahead and had Gaddafi give up his nukes, give up his entire program in 2003. 2011, miraculously enough, wait for it, the Arab Spring. If you believe that the Arab Spring was a real spring, I got a spring I can sell you in Death Valley. The Arab Spring was nothing but a CIA plot concocted to shake up the Middle East leadership. You think you're Hussein? Really? You going to get off the dollar? No, you ain't. Because if you recall, not a single democracy sprung out of the Arab Spring. Egypt is still a presidential dictatorship. The only, quote, democracy is Israel. And they're only democratic to their people in Israel, not so democratic outside. But everybody else, regular old dictatorship. We didn't get a single government turnover out of the Arab Spring, but it was enough to make an excuse to go into Libya and then Syria. We started bombing Syria. Get to that in a second. But Kim Jong-un sees this. He sees that in 2011, in March of 11, we authorized the bombing of Libya between us and the French. And why was that? Because Muammar Gaddafi was going to get off of the dollar and the euro. And he was going to create an Afrocentric currency. Some people tease and say he was going to invent the Afro. Really, he was going to take the Arab dinar that Libya was already using, make it continent-wide in Africa, gold-backed, because they had 144 tons of gold in Libya alone, which isn't even a third of the size of Britain, who doesn't even have that much gold. And so they're going to take their real oil, their real gold, their real silver, and combine that with the assets of the rest of the African continent, call it the United States of Africa, and tell the Brits and the French and the euro and the dollar to go fuck themselves. Well, that's when we decided he was a brutal dictator and he had to go. And so they lynched him in the street. They beat him to death alive and they killed his family. So Kim Jong-un sees this. He sees the deal we made with Iran 3 years ago and then backed out of it. Now we're backing out of it. We're finding a reason to back out of it so that we can have an excuse to go bomb them. We're listening to Benjamin Netanyahu, who along with a lot of people, told us that there was WMDs in Iraq and we needed to go in there. $15 trillion later, and we're also now bombing Syria. And John Bolton and the crazy Trump cabinet are trying to justify putting boots on the ground in Syria. Beg your pardon while I take a sip. Boots on the ground in Syria. Excuse me. Where was I? Oh, yeah. John Bolton's trying to justify putting boots on the ground in Syria. And Kim Jong-un sees this. And then we wonder why he's leery. Wouldn't you be? It's like having an ex that routinely cheats on you, and then she gives you a case of the clap. What would you do? Again, the phrase I like a lot is, or question rather, isn't it emotionally and intellectually dishonest to expect somebody to not behave like a human being in a human situation? Guy's trying to protect his country, what little he's got. And I know North Korea is not great to live. I've read reports and everything. But what does that make us? We've got austerity measures going on in this country. We've got half the people in this country making under 30 grand a year. We've got 40% of homeless people with jobs. 40% of homeless people have jobs in this country, and they live in their car. Excuse me. So all that to say, we're preaching to the world. We don't even have single-payer health care. And let me clarify something on that really fast if you're thinking about what I think you're thinking. And that's a whole an hour show. And I'm going to probably do an hour on single payer by myself in a few more episodes. It's more interesting to talk to people. But once in a while, I got to get something off my chest. People confuse single payer for the VA because they'll say, oh, well, in England, blah, 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 or in France, you don't get right away. Probably not. I don't live in those countries. And I only have heard anecdotal evidence, not an epidemic. Big difference. But the VA, if you want to get an idea of what Britain and France go through, the VA is a good idea because the VA sucks. The VA doesn't fucking work. Why don't we get rid of the VA, fire everybody, and put all those vets on Medicare? Because Medicare does work. Because it's the difference of a payer versus a provider. And the government provider, the VA, is horrible. But the government insurer, Medicare, my mom's got it, your mom's got it, your grandma's got it. And it's the largest insurer in the country, and it works. My mother never gets denied. Not for an MRI, not for prescriptions, whatever. Her copay is minuscule. Oh, and by the way, in case you think I'm a communist, look at your paycheck stub if you have one, because you're paying for it already. You pay about $100 a month on average for Medicare that you can't get till you're 65. We pay $1.3 trillion for defense. What I'm saying is you take the already existing Medicare budget, up it by $50 billion. We keep paying our copay that we've already been paying, which is about $100 compared to $300 or $500 or $1,000. And voila, everyone gets single payer. No problem. And it's cheaper than the fucking bullshit high price system that we have here. And we're the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't have anything like that. So consider that, because this is not left or right. This is 2 + 2 is fucking 4. That being said, as I wrap up, in 1967, the so-called liberal establishment basically disowned Martin Luther King, because he started talking about the war in Vietnam, and he flatly said that we cannot expect to be a humanitarian country and to have civil rights for our American citizens when we're behaving like brutes overseas, specifically Vietnam, which was an illegal war we didn't belong in. Johnson made that shit up. The Gulf of Tonkin was made up. The people who served in that war, God bless you, because you did what you thought was the right thing. Where I get angry is your government lied to you. Our government lies to our troops. And King saw that. And he also was trying to declare a war on poverty. And he had a couple of groups going to try to fix that, to try to stem wealth inequality. And when I say that, people get kind of pissy because they think I'm trying to go after rich people to take their shit. And that's what I'm doing. I'm saying that it's unequal for Apple to pay 0.005% in tax, while I pay way more than that. You pay way more than that. If you have a paycheck, you see exactly what they take out. Why is IBM getting a $500 million refund on their taxes? On what level does that even make sense? So Martin Luther King was talking about all that 50 years ago, and nothing's changed. See, because what he didn't realize, or maybe he did, because when Lyndon Johnson called him into his office to let him know that his Secret Service detail was going to be suspended indefinitely, they both knew that was a death sentence. And that came from J. Edgar Hoover, who Johnson was terrified of because J. Edgar Hoover had the dirt on everybody. But all that to say that separating a lunch counter, integrating a lunch counter, a segregated lunch counter, making everybody shake hands and have a hamburger together, that doesn't cost money. You get in the way of the war, you get in the way of taxes, and how the wealthy, not the rich, the wealthy, the 0.001% who really run everything, are going to start distributing their funds. Somebody's going to die. That's what that means, because money equals you're dead. So anyway, all that to say, you guys, kind of what I wanted to get off my chest as we embark on the eve of, or the week before the negotiations with North Korea and the United States. Hopefully it goes well. I'd like to think it'll go well. I believe that a stop clock can tell the time right twice a day. I'm hoping this could be the one time that Donald Trump does something right. And if it does turn out okay, and there is a decent compromise, I hope we don't fuck North Korea the same way we fucked a billion other countries in this world over the last 100 years or so. Since the Spanish-American War, all of our wars except for World War II have been bullshit. The Spanish-American War was another war on a lie. We made that up too. So that being said, folks, I know a lot of this can be uncomfortable, and it's designed to maybe make you think, because I think about it. So if it does make you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.
The world is like a ride at an amusement park, and when you choose to go on it, you think it's real, because that's how powerful our minds are. And the ride goes up and down and round and round. It has thrills and chills, and it's very brightly colored, and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while. Some people have been on the ride for a long time, and they begin to question, is this real, or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they come back to us, and they say, hey, don't worry, don't be afraid, ever, because this is just a ride. But we always kill those good guys who try and tell us that. You ever notice that? And let the demons run amok? But it doesn't matter, because it's just a ride. And we can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love. The eyes of fear want you to put bigger locks on your door, buy guns, close yourself off. The eyes of love instead see all of us as one. Here's what we can do to change the world right now to a better ride. Take all that money we spend on weapons and defense each year and instead spend it feeding, clothing, and educating the poor of the world, which it would many times over, not one human being excluded, and we can explore space. together, both inner and outer, forever in peace.